Have you ever said or thought, I have to lose weight for my health? If you're like most people, you probably believe that weight loss is required in order to achieve health or improve your health. But what if I told you that that's not true, that weight and health aren't the same thing, and that you can actually improve your health without ever stepping on the scale? That's exactly why I invited my friend and colleague, Val Schonberg, to talk about what is the difference between weight care, health care, and how do we set behavior based goals that have nothing to do with the number on the scale. Val's episode is kicking off this month's non-diet resolution challenge. Next week, I'll be joined by Dr. Emma Beckett talking about how to spot misinformation in the media. And in 2 weeks, I'll be back with a solo episode just before we start the live challenge. So if you haven't saved your spot in this year's non-diet resolution challenge, go to the show notes or the comment section on YouTube and make sure that you save your spot. This is my most popular free training that I offer every year. It will help you get out and stay out of the diet mentality this year so that you can focus on the things that really matter. Hi, Val. Welcome back to the Midlife Feast.
Hi, Jen. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, this is the third time. So I think anybody who is a regular listener will certainly recognize your voice, your name, because we've done two other episodes talking about insulin resistance and eating disorders, which are two very important topics. But today's episode is actually one that I asked my Instagram community a couple of months ago. What would you like Val and I to talk about next? And we put up a few topics. And this one, I think, won by like 46%, that people wanted to hear us talk out why isn't weight a proxy for health? Or just trying to add more to this conversation about weight and health, which seems or sometimes feels like it's a slam dunk in the medical world that losing weight is always going to be health promoting or is always a good idea. So before we dig into all that though, can you just tell us a little bit about you and who you are and just kind of a little bit of your background for maybe someone who hasn't listened to you before?
Sure. Well, I am a registered dietitian. I'm also a board certified specialist in sports dietetics. So I do a lot in sports nutrition, as well as I'm a certified menopause practitioner. So midlife health, especially women's health, is really near and dear to my heart and where I spend a lot of my time immersed in the research and the literature. But I have this extensive background working in eating disorders. So it's a little bit of a Venn diagram of those three environments and, addressing the health and nutrition needs of a lot of different people as it comes to that. My background is that I'm originally from Minnesota. So my private practice is in Atlanta. I live in Atlanta, Georgia now. But I'm originally from Minnesota, well, even before that, Nebraska. So I'm a Midwestern girl. And when it comes to the United States, but it's interesting as it relates to this topic. I think about my own. I think all of us who work in a weight neutral space, which we'll probably get into that, have our own personal background with potentially dieting and trying to lose weight, and oftentimes in the spirit of health, right?
Mhm.
Even if it wasn't necessarily totally driven by that, we told ourselves that was what it was. So I started my nutrition degree back in 1992, coming out of really that low fat, non fat space. And I was very focused on helping people lose weight by taking fat out of their diet. And fast forward, long story short, is that didn't work, as we know historically, but it didn't really work for me either. It did at first, right? There was a huge sense of control. I'm brilliant at calorie counting and tracking all of that. And all I found over, I don't know, a decade or two of doing that kind of stuff was learning that what you do is you don't really achieve much in terms of weight loss, but even if you do, and you do kind of temporarily feel better in your body, the weight regain and the overshoot when you release those diet rules is horrendous. And so I definitely have this lived experience, and I have a passion for helping women just be at peace in their relationship with food and their relationship with their body. So that drives a lot of the work that I do. And then secondary to this is being immersed in the research since the 80s and knowing like we are saying the same thing over and over and over, that diets don't work and that weight cycling is problematic. And here we are in 2024, and we're doing the same thing over and over. So I just am really passionate about, even as clinicians, and kind of bringing this weight neutral perspective into helping people realize that there is a better way to finding peace in your relationship with food and body, and then overall you can be healthy.
Thanks so much for that, Val. I think that one of the things that we connected over way back when, I think when you were at a menopause conference, a menopause society conference, and I was following your stories, was the lack of weight neutral research, especially in the midlife space. And even a few years ago, because I think it was a few years ago now, there was a lot of noise coming into the menopause nutrition, menopause health conversations, and really fear mongering, if we're going to be honest, about if your weight is changing, you better get on top of it. You better do something about it. This big bad thing is coming for you. It's like the weight gain train of menopause. So many of the conversations started to become even more weight centric than they had been, which is saying a lot because they were already pretty weight centric to start with. So let's kind of dive in a little bit to why we think, or why diet culture has led us to believe that it is such a strong connection between weight and health. Maybe another way of putting it is, what are some of the misconceptions or the common myths that you hear about weight and health, or that maybe we think that society as a whole has about them?
Yeah. Well, I think one way to neutralize it for everyone who might be listening is that it's two different paradigms, really. So there are individuals who really look at this through the weight equals health research. And it's just kind of the way they perceive that. And then there's those of us who look at it through the, well, no, there's so many confounding factors to the weight element. And so it can't be just weight equals health. There's flaws in that particular perspective. And I think those on the weight centric side would say the same about people who are weight neutral. They're like, there are flaws in that research. So I think it's helpful to say, look, there's two different ways that we are looking at health as it relates to weight. And if we can take the emotion out of it and say that, okay, there is some literature that suggests maybe there's some causal factors. I haven't really seen a lot of that, but there's all of this other research that's from the weight neutral space, but that often gets clouded by the weight equals health narrative. So that's one thing, is recognize, okay, there's just two different viewpoints. It's how we're looking at this science, it's how we're studying and our experience and all of that. But then there's also, this has been a driver for a long time, like really taking us back to the 1950s, where you're really looking at the idea that weight is something that does translate into health outcomes. And then you fast forward over a few decades, and those proponents of that weight is so important and tied up in health really kind of drove a lot of the definitions related to BMI and those BMI classifications and how we determine things that are quote unquote overweight or quote unquote obese, and obesity is really tangled up in all of that. And then fast forward to 2013, where the American Medical Association wanted to classify obesity as a disease for a whole bunch of reasons, but largely it contributes to research dollars. It contributes to pharmaceutical research and interventions. And they said that that would help decrease stigma around weight, which even back then we knew that would not happen. But there was an opposing viewpoint to that that said at that position, no, there's too much research that says weight isn't necessarily a predictor of health or mortality outcomes. So we can't really say, based on the definitions of disease, that obesity in and of itself is a disease. Well, nevertheless, that got pushed through, right? So then we have quote unquote obesity. And I say quote unquote because obesity is such a stigmatizing word, and all we're doing to define it is BMI, which everyone would agree is very problematic, but we just keep going back to it. So it's helpful for the listeners to understand that some of why there's such a domineering or dominant message around weight and health is because of some of this political history, really tied up in, look, we got to get this definition out there. We got to get this diagnosis so that we can do research and get some pharmaceuticals to eventually to do the interventions and treatment. And I think that's why that narrative has also been really promoted quite strongly.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate the kind of historical context on that. And I don't think we have enough time to get into all the problems with BMI. I will try and link some resources in the show notes of maybe some other podcasts that do kind of dive into that. But really, whenever you see a study and the headline or how it's reported says weight increases risk of XYZ, they're using BMI, right? That is how they are categorizing, what category of weight a person is in. They're not typically looking at behaviors. They're not typically looking at other things. They're using this really simplified formula that uses data that you can collect quickly and easily in an office setting or a research setting to categorize people as easily as possible. And it's an oversimplification. I mean, I think that's kind of one of the biggest things about BMI, which thankfully we saw some wonderful media or social media around that during the Olympics with, athletes kind of saying like, hey, look at my BMI. I'm in the overweight or the obese category. So that was kind of a really relevant reminder. But I think that that's one of the hardest things is that people will see these media headlines, or even healthcare practitioners in a clinical setting will be getting continuing education or doing research. And that is kind of always the conclusion is like, well, look, weight has the strongest association. But that is assuming that weight is a proxy for health. And that is where the weight neutral space tries to say, wait, hold on a second. We can't say that weight is a proxy for health. Therefore, we cannot say that modifying weight is going to result in an XYZ change in health. Right?
Well, and then let's add to that, because I think this is where the midlife woman comes into having even more confusing messaging, is that now we have this normal weight obesity narrative too, which is that, oh, it's about body composition. So as women are naturally experiencing a shift in where their body fat is stored in the abdomen, then even if they tell us that, I'm not that worried about the scale, but my shape has changed and my doctor's telling me that because my cholesterol is increased or this is happening, that now I need to get rid of the belly fat. So now we're focusing on spot reducing, which we know, any of us who've been around enough know that that's not really something we can do. But that becomes, even when someone says, yeah, but I'm still gaining weight and I shouldn't be gaining weight, because that's going to increase my risk of health problems. And that's where I see a lot of the midlife and older women feeling really scared, because it's like, man, like my body's out of control. This is happening. And then they see some health markers, maybe even shifts in their previous conversation about A1C. And lo and behold, we're still back to the dieting and the weight-centric narrative. So just to be clear, that I think that even the medical establishment is saying, yeah, we recognize that BMI isn't super helpful. So now we're going to measure waist circumference and we're going to put more emphasis on, body composition. And I think that's a really risky proposition when it comes to our older individuals, where we know that increasing body fat is not necessarily catastrophic. And it actually seems to be a protective, if not just normal, natural part of the process. And I do see that as becoming an emerging problem as well.
So even if we can wrap our heads around weight is not a proxy for health, and okay, maybe if my BMI has changed, not that anyone should be worried about BMI, but like if the number on the scale is going up, maybe I can kind of sort of buy into it. It's still a really hard thing to separate out in our day-to-day lives. And a lot of that, I think, is based on what we see in the media. We're constantly bombarded with it. What are some of the other reasons why it's hard for an individual, let alone a healthcare practitioner, to maintain that separation between weight and health?
Yeah, I think there's a few reasons. One is that we are immersed, like we are raised up in a culture that has put so much stigma on weight that people who are in larger bodies they're lazy, they're not addressing their health, they don't eat well enough, they don't exercise enough, and there's just this stigmatizing language that is associated with body size. And so we get immersed in that. I mean, I've seen individuals, high schoolers that I'm treating for an eating disorder that we trace back to a health class. I mean, eating disorders are biopsychosocial illnesses. There's many precipitating factors, but they hear that obesity is this horrible thing that you're going to get judged. And so it's this shame-based messaging, even in health classes as a young person. And so it's like, well, I don't want that. And so then we kind of fall into this, well, I'm going to do everything to be healthy. And maybe someone in their adult years never kind of quote unquote worried about their weight. And then they go through this transition and they're like, wait a second, now I'm getting fat. And then all of the thoughts and ideas about what that means is a bad thing instead of, nope, your body's changing and it's okay. Like, let's bring it back to lifestyle. So I think there's that. It's this immersion that we've had in terms of how we look at body size or body fatness. Okay. So then the other part of this is how it feels in your body. So when your body changes and there's this discomfort, like I got to go buy new clothes, my clothes don't fit the same anymore. That might increase body dissatisfaction. Maybe your views of body image, even if they're shifting or they've always been tied up in your self-worth, I think that can contribute to the buying into weight equals health. Like, okay, but I still need to lose weight for all these reasons. So when I know you and I do similar work in terms of trying to help women come into a space of tuning into their body, nourishing their body from a place of respect and care, and we're going to trust our body, that our body knows what it needs at this stage of life when we are nourishing it and doing joyful movement and managing all these other stressors in life. But then women will still come back to, but I still want to lose weight. And oftentimes it's tied into body dissatisfaction. And then second to that would be the weight equals health narrative. So we can do all kinds of debunking, like you and I could go on for another hour talking about all the research that says, nope, there are plenty of things that we can show that when you do this or eat this way, even if weight doesn't change, your health outcomes improve. We have research to document that. And so we can rationally wrap our head around it. But then there's still this embodiment. There's this experience of, but I don't want my body to change. Like that's super uncomfortable. And I get reminders on these messages in social media or, diet culture that I don't have to let my body change, that I should fight back and fight my biology. So I think that's why we end up in this vicious cycle too, especially at this stage of life.
I think that's a great summary. And the only thing I would add to it is that we, even if it has not been true in our own lived experience, so even if losing weight has not improved our health and losing weight has not led us to feeling more comfortable in a more sustainable way in our bodies, our default is to think that we did something wrong and that we just have to try a different way, or we have to try again, or we have to try harder. And it is because of this indoctrination into believing that, well, if I lose weight, I will by default almost it's like the de facto way of feeling better, improving my body image, when really that's not the case, because we know that people in all body sizes and shapes experience struggles with their body image dissatisfaction, changes in health status, changes in health markers. There is not a single thing that we can pin on body size.
Right.
But that is so pervasive as the message that, yeah, it keeps coming up. Like I always refer to it as default programming, that, until you're changing your default programming, it doesn't matter what script you're running. You can be running a non-diet intuitive eating script, but you'll run up with like what I call a syntax error, which I think is like a reference to anybody who grew up in the 80s and the 90s. And then you have to like start the script all over again. And, so what we want to do is spend less time looking at the script and more time looking at the assumptions. What is running your script? What are the beliefs, and what are the things in your life that are holding up those beliefs? Because if you can't change those, you have to have a way to kind of counter them, to at least kind of balance that influence, because it's everywhere. You don't have to look hard to find diet culture hiding in every, not even hiding, just in every corner.
Right.
But let's take a minute to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think what's kind of within that, it was just so funny because I used to work for IBM. That's a
Oh,
side note too. I get all that computer stuff. But, the thought is that we can control our body weight. And that is, and maybe at some point in our lifespan, we might have been able to control it within some particular range, and people learn that. But really, what we know in terms of physiology and research and all of this is that we really can't control our body weight as much as it's suggested. So then that's a source of some of that misinformation. And then I think second to that, which I get asked about quite a bit, is, are women, misled in terms of menopause, right? Like they're shocked that that the average weight gain is 5 pounds over the menopause transition, and women weren't warned about this. And I'm like, look, if it were only 5 pounds, we would not be having this conversation. So that is another source of misinformation, is that you look at certain studies and they will say, yeah, on average, women gain 1.5 pounds per year during the menopause transition, or they gain on average 5 pounds. And then when women are gaining 10 or 20 pounds in a year, they're like, what in the world? Like, what is happening to me? What am I doing wrong? When that's just because the headlines haven't really shown you all of what the research is saying. So I think that is kind of where, luckily, in the menopause space, which, as we know, used to be a taboo topic, and now we're spending more time educating women, helping them understand what to expect. But what we're missing is the weight messaging, that, what, it's not too abnormal to gain weight, and the amount that you might gain is really highly variable. There's a lot of individuality to that, a lot of social determinants of health that contribute to that. And I think that is another important piece of why it can feel so confusing to women, that they're like, but I still need to lose weight. And the other thing that you said that I kind of wanted to tap into too, just to justify this, because I work again with a lot of athletes. So these are women who are doing quite a bit of activity, and then their bodies are changing. And so it is this like, yeah, I'm not so worried about the scale, but my body composition is changing. And so there's this kind of thin narrative as well, that I want to maintain my younger body. And so one of the things that I kind of talk about when it comes to body image is, okay, maybe in terms of body image in your younger years, you were dealing with fat talk, right? Like,
mm-hmm.
oh, they've lost so much weight, or, some of that kind of narrative. Well, now we're butting up against the old talk. Like, oh, you look so young for your age. Or, oh my gosh, did you see like that person, like that 85-year-old, they look so young, or they look old. And now I think we have a couple things kind of coming at women in the anti-aging space, which says not only should you look a certain way and your body not change, but also if you stay thin, well, then that aligns with the healthy, successful portrayal of women today, that, older, unhealthy women are certainly not what anyone wants to do or become. And I think that's another of the fear that gets into the weight narrative as well.
Oh, there's definitely a feminist thread that runs deep in all of this, that needs to run deep, right? That we need to, I think, just be changing that narrative. We need to be involved in that. And I think our generation is actually doing a decent job as much as we can, given lots of things that we can't control. But I want to spend a minute, not a super long time, but I do want to spend a minute talking about how do we know that diets don't work? And I'm going to put a link to an episode with Dr. Amy Porto a few months ago where we talked about the Minnesota starvation experiment, which is probably near and dear to your heart, being from Minnesota. But this is also an area when I think when people are separating out weight from health, that it's hard, even if their lived experience tells them this is true, deep in their bones, that it's really hard to understand, but maybe I should just try again. Maybe if I tried harder. I'd love to hear how you kind of explain why diets don't work.
Yeah, well, the biggest reason it's that it's a futile process. So, most women by this age at least potentially had that lived experience that
Mhm.
they did a diet, they lost weight, and then the weight came back on and potentially more, and then they do another diet and they lose the weight and the weight comes back on and potentially more. And so by the time I see women in their 40s and beyond, they've potentially been dieting for 20 to even 40 years. And
Yeah.
so it's kind of like, well, you have this data, you have this evidence for just yourself. But we can see this in large studies that dieting or weight loss interventions, first and foremost, cause anxiety and stress. I mean, just the idea of, okay, I need to lose 20 pounds is going to set you up for an element of some anxiety and stress at a time in our life where we have enough stress to deal with.
Mhm.
So I think that's really an important part. But really, this is well documented again in research to say that if we go down this diet intervention road, which as we go through the years, there's more, whether it's intermittent fasting or the keto diet, or, it used to be paleo and then it used to be Whole30. Maybe those are still kind of around, but there's always something. There's always something. And it's like, nope, this isn't about, dieting. This is about wellness. Okay. So you do this restrictive diet, you lose some weight, you gain the weight back. And guess what? You don't realize any health benefits when you stay in that cycle.
Yeah.
That's the problem, is that we can talk about specifically endometrial cancer, where you can look at a study and if someone loses weight or is at a certain body weight, that maybe their risk of endometrial cancer is lower. But when they have weight cycled, and there's studies that show this, 5 to 6 times of doing this, lose weight, gain weight, lose weight, gain weight, their risk of endometrial cancer is almost 40% higher than if
Wow.
someone would have never lost weight. So when a physician tells someone their risk of endometrial cancer is high if they don't try weight loss, and then they've never really done an assessment of have they ever tried to lose weight? Like, what is going on here? Most women have tried to lose weight. Well, then that's a contraindicated recommendation, really. So that's something important to know, is
Yeah.
that diets don't work because we've experienced it, but you stay in this vicious diet cycle or weight cycle, and then you're not getting any health benefits. Versus if we focus on how can we support you in terms of physical activity. So if you even just look at cardiorespiratory fitness and the benefits on terms of cardiovascular health, cancer, and all-cause mortality, there's pretty clear data on that, irrespective of weight loss, that helping someone stay committed or connected or consistent with physical activity that they enjoy, that in and of itself can have benefits. Then if you even just look at fruit and vegetable intake, I mean, we have research that shows just fruit and vegetable intake, or things like, dietary approaches to stop hypertension. When you look at the literature, which is focused on the benefits of fruits and vegetables, or potassium intake, or dairy, and the calcium delivery to the body. And so food itself and, having that type of a, eating and nourishing your body, that then you get health benefits. So you may or may not lose weight, but the health benefits are definitely going to be more associated with those behaviors than this futile cycle of losing and gaining and losing and gaining. And that is pretty well established in the literature. It's just it doesn't make headlines.
And also, and thank you for summarizing that. And also, we are hardwired to resist biologically, psychologically under eating. And we're not talking about under eating 500 calories a day. We're talking about any kind of pattern of continued caloric restriction will be perceived as a potential lack of access to reliable food. And so you
Mhm.
become more interested in food. All food starts to look good. I always joke that, I knew I was at the breaking point of my diet when a sleeve of rice cakes started to look like a delectable treat, even though I would never touch them any other time. So we become interested in eating, and that is kind of that's biologically hardwired that, our body resists weight loss. And that's just a fact. And
Mhm.
so the more times we force it or try to force it to pursue intentional weight loss, the harder and harder it becomes to achieve and maintain, which is where the weight cycling information is, and especially the research around weight cycling is saying like, hey, wait a minute, this isn't benign. To tell people to keep trying when there are potential consequences to that are impacting the exact thing they're trying to manage is like that they're not receiving informed consent with that. They're not
Right.
being told like, hey, there's a really potential big side effect to keep pursuing intentional weight loss. And that is you're probably going to end up at a higher weight, and there are independent risk factors associated with weight cycling. I think if people were told that in their medical conversations, they would maybe take a minute before saying like, maybe I'm not going to start counting all my calories again. But I'd love to talk about some of the weight research, especially around behaviors, because one of the weight neutral messages that sometimes gets lost in the anti-diet messages is that we are still promoting healthy behaviors.
Mhm.
Like at no point is this not about health. Is that at no point are we not talking about fruits and vegetables and the value of adding in foods for health reasons even. We're just saying don't choose foods and don't count, measure, and track them for the purposes of pursuing intentional weight loss, which is where some of this research on behaviors can be so interesting. And one particular study that we were talking about before we started to record is one from, I think, a decade ago now, maybe 2012, I want to say, or 2014. And admittedly, it's looking at, a younger population. I think it was about 11,000 people, but all adults. And when they compared four behaviors, smoking, alcohol intake, regular activity, and consuming 5 servings of fruits and vegetables, which is not as much as people think. It is not like 5, 10 cup servings. Like these are usually half to 1 cup servings, depending on the fruit or vegetable. That the risk of all cause mortality, so dying of any reason, was essentially equal between all the BMI groups. And I think that that's such an important reminder of what actually matters. We get so lost in the granularity of like kale being better than romaine lettuce and that kind of stuff. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that research and just other research that talks about the behaviors that matter.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that research is there. And then again, it like we were talking about, it kind of gets buried and we don't pay attention to it. And so I think recognizing that in that particular study that you're mentioning, um, because I mean, I think it goes, we're saying like smoking, alcohol intake were two of the behaviors that they were looking at with that, and then activity and specifically fruit and vegetable intake. And so it didn't matter what your body size was. If you
Mm-hmm.
had more of those behaviors, like 3 or 4, your risk of different diseases was similar. So weight
Yeah.
wasn't an element. I think other interesting research is even if you look at bariatric surgery, well, someone will say, okay, but if you have bariatric surgery, your health outcomes improve. So then weight is a part of it. Well, a lot of those health outcomes are improved within a week after the surgery, before weight loss has really happened. And if you look at the hypothesis of why that might be, is because they've been doing restrictive eating going into the surgery and short term after. So whether it's bariatric surgery or the new weight loss drugs, you're still changing your behavior. You're
Mm-hmm.
changing your eating. The Look Ahead trial is another really good example of some of this. And this is a study where it's a huge study. Individuals had type 2 diabetes and they were in our age range. Like they are the older
Mm-hmm.
individuals. I think there were, I don't know how many sites around the United States, kind of
Yeah, I can't
forgetting
remember now.
specifically, but like almost 4,000 participants. And it went on for 8 years. And what they were looking at is what is the impact of an intensive lifestyle intervention on decreasing cardiovascular health outcomes. And they had to stop the study early because there was no benefit. So they're like, okay, this is futile. But at the same time, when you look at the weight loss data on that particular study, in the first year, these individuals, now intensive lifestyle intervention for your listeners is really something that I come back to too, because whether we're measuring blood pressure outcomes or cardiovascular health outcomes or type 2 diabetes, when they do these intensive lifestyle interventions, we are talking about weekly appointments in groups, small groups. They have tailored dietary goals. They meet with an exercise physiologist to do their exercise 3 to 4 times a week. And they're doing this for like 6 months. So when you get all of that support, you're changing your behaviors. Like they're getting problem solving,
Yeah.
they're managing cravings, meal planning. So when you look at these types of interventions and then you see like, oh man, these people are losing weight. Okay, well, so they lose weight, their A1C improves, but now we have 8-year data to say, well, most of the people gain the weight back. And in fact, for the people who completed the study, the average weight loss was 4.7%.
Mm-hmm.
And the A1C came all the way back up to baseline.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at like, okay, well, dieting in and of itself, restrictive eating, but like even the defense of the body, because a lot of these people were still eating well. The Biggest Loser study is another great example. This isn't
Mm-hmm.
that people, just going back to binge eating or anything. They're still maintaining, healthy eating patterns, exercise, but the biology is defending itself. But the look ahead study is a good example of where they said, okay, don't dismiss this study. There were important health outcomes beyond even just looking at the cardiovascular risk. So it was really because of these behaviors that people had learned problem solving skills for, stabilizing their eating pattern and doing regular activity. So that's, I think, what happens is we focus on the research so often at just looking at that outcome of the scale and the weight, and we miss there's so many other biological benefits to just doing the behaviors. So yes, that there's a lot of different studies that will show that.
So hopefully people can hear from what we're saying that the research is out there. And this isn't something that we're making up, not just we, but the bigger kind of, weight neutral community. And because behaviors are something that we can control more than our weight, weight is not a behavior. It is a complex outcome of many different factors, many of which we can't control. We do like to talk about the behaviors that we can add in. So what does a weight neutral approach look like? What are some of the things that, we've talked about fruits and vegetables, we've talked about movement. What are some of the other ways that we can pursue health without weight loss?
Yeah, I mean, I think intuitive eating is kind of a way that we, kind of shorten that answer. But what does that really mean? Is really first starting with tuning into your body. Like, are you even aware of your internal cues? Because with a history of dieting or external messages telling you what and when to eat, you probably don't really know what you need to do. So it's getting some guidance on stabilizing your eating. So then if you have this like skewed eating pattern where you skip breakfast, skimp on lunch, and catch up later in the day, well, just simply stabilizing your eating, of giving, having confidence that you can eat 3 or 4 times a day. And then that might be a start. And then the next element might be, okay, well, when we are eating, what do we want to be including? Like, are we overdoing fruits and vegetables? Or is that something that you're not including? Maybe you don't like vegetables. Okay, well, let's work with your food preferences, build meals and snacks that make sense, but include a variety of these important foods, right? Starches, grains, a lot of those have been demonized. So how do we reclaim those? So that's the other thing is I think like the Mediterranean diet gets a lot of attention, and once again, we kind of get fixated on that. Oh, it can only be these foods instead of no, it's the dietary pattern as a whole. And what that looks like is certainly plant foods, fruits, vegetables, grains, nuts, seeds, different kinds of protein based on your food preferences. So I think that's one of the most important elements is it really depends because it depends on where that individual's at. I think secondary to that, and this is where both you and I talk, and many in our professional group, we talk about this quite a bit, is this fixation on protein though. So people will say, yeah, I'm weight neutral. And then how many grams of protein do I need to eat? And it's like, okay, but so let's rewind. And like, we're not paying attention to grams of protein. We're saying, when you have breakfast, what kind of foods do you enjoy? Are we just having a granola bar? Or can we add a yogurt to that? Could we add some nuts? Okay, voila, you've got some protein. And that's another thing where I think we we will say, yeah, 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 yeah. And then there's still this health halo on something that we need to be doing perfect, correct, and right. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be respectful of all of the different foods, including protein, but sometimes we still kind of attach onto something that really is a part of diet culture. And because we don't know for sure exactly how many grams per kilogram per day is the sweet spot for ensuring that we're protecting our musculoskeletal health, because that's a whole nother part of the conversation that we haven't talked about, like the downsides of dieting. In addition to the one thing I had said, like weight cycling increases your risk of certain cancers and other problems, but there is a downside to dieting and restrictive eating, which is loss of lean tissue, potential loss of bone mass at a time in our life when we can't really just get that back. And so, yes, stabilizing your eating, looking at, what kind of foods do we need to reclaim? And then the other part of that I feel is super important is, do you enjoy your meals? Like, do you enjoy what you're eating? Because if you don't, and you have this chicken, broccoli, rice kind of thing, and you're like, see, I got my protein, I got my carbs. And yeah, but like, I mean, I love a meal like that too, but I also like a really good fried chicken and collard greens and, grits kind of meal too. So are you ever getting reward from your meals and your snacks? Or are they so perfect, correct, and right in terms of all of these nutritional profiles that are out there that you're missing out on things that really have good food memories, are things you really enjoy? You got that satisfaction principle, right? So are you really satisfied and enjoying your meals? And that's why certainly, the chicken, rice, broccoli kind of meal can be just as healthy as a cream of blah, blah, blah soup that we're not labeling as a keto soup. It just happens to, you know, like it just cracks me up when they'll have like keto potato soup. And it's like, it's cream of potato soup. Or it can't be. That wouldn't be keto. I don't what which one it is. I saw it and I'm like, can we just take off the labeling?
I know. I mean, and the labels are a big part of the problem, right?
Yeah.
There's so much labeling of like low carb, high protein, plant forward, grain free. All of these things confuse things because it gives people the impression that those are important definitions, and they're usually not.
Hmm.
Unless you're a diabetic, you don't need to know if something is low carb or high carb. You know what I mean? Like, there are very few circumstances where that's actually helpful information. More often than not, those labels just are marketing and they just make things more complicated. But to just, emphasize the pleasure of eating, food is meant to be pleasurable. I say that all the time. It is meant to be pleasurable. And in fact, you should try to include it in however you choose to plan to eat, because if you are only planning for the nutrition and not the pleasure and not of the all of the other functions that food serves, it's not going to be sustainable and you're not going to want to do it. And just to like dot the I on the point that you made about muscle, I have taken to saying this fairly bluntly, that I would rather gain fat than lose muscle in postmenopause.
Mm,
And I
that's
will
a
say
great
that
one.
unapologetically. And when I say it that way, because it is hard, it's not impossible, but it is harder to build and maintain muscle. I see that now, 3 years post menopause. If we go away for a 2 week vacation, I absolutely feel the loss of strength even just when I get back to my regular movement, like 2 weeks. It
Mm.
comes back, but it's not as flexible as it was. And so pursuing intentional weight loss, especially when it is aggressive, really big caloric deficits or, any of the other means by which people pursue aggressive weight loss, always comes with muscle loss.
Hmm.
It is a very difficult side effect to control for. So just to kind of dot that I on that.
Yeah,
So
and I would say that like for the individual who might be listening and saying, I think that like when I'm meeting with individuals and they really started from a place of, I feel like I need to lose weight or I want to lose weight. And we talk through all of this stuff where I try to help people come back to is, look, you're trying to get control. Like some of this is life feels out of control. My body's out of control. My weight's out of control. How do I get control back? And so it's these kinds of things where you can look through like, assess your nutrition. Like,
mhm.
are you overeating? Could you eat any less? Like, if you can like say, no, I have these pretty balanced meals most of the time. I have some fun foods in there, but I'm not overeating. And then my exercise, I do, sustainable, consistent, enjoyable movement. Maybe sleep might be a problem. That might be something that you can address. But assuming all of those other factors, that's when, okay, kind of check the boxes and then say, all right, like there's nothing I can do to change my body weight that's not going to come with a potential unintentional harm, like
Mm-hmm.
muscle loss or bone loss. And so I think that becomes a way to dialogue with yourself when it starts to feel really like a lot of pressure, like I need to lose weight at all costs. Like, really, let's get rid of the at all costs stuff part of it. And
Mm-hmm.
let's look back to what are the healthy habits that maybe we need to address and do that in a meaningful way that fits in with your lifestyle and your food preferences. And the other, I think, element that can be helpful is when we're shifting from weight to well being. Well, the well being part of it is also maybe you need to reassess your values and your health goals and what's really important to you at this stage of life. Maybe weight has felt really important. Maybe it's a part of your identity. You looked a certain way and that was just something you took for granted and now your body's changing. Okay, but there's other things that we care about. And that might just be, I want to be mobile. I want to maintain independent living. I want to be able to travel when I'm 80. I want to run around and chase after grandkids. Whatever that might be, then just keep shifting back to that. What will your lifestyle look like for you to be able to travel, chase around your grandkids, do the things that you're passionate about? And because most likely you'll be able to notice, like, I need to eat. Human bodies actually need nourishment. We cannot survive without
Not
food.
optional.
Surprise, surprise. And movement, like if you want to be able to hike, you got to hike, it's got to happen. So it's irrespective of what your weight is, you can do all those things. And I know that's sometimes really hard, that process to get to that place of body peace and body trust, but it is possible. And a lot of people can do it.
Thank you so much, Val. And I just to kind of round out this conversation, I hope that we've given everyone a summary, an overview, some reassurance that this weight neutral approach is actually very evidence-based and that weight as a proxy for health is not the slam dunk case that maybe you've been led to believe. But even when we know all that, I think the part that requires maybe more support is uncoupling the belief that your weight is tied to your worth and your value.
Mhm.
And so even when we can get ourselves into a place of like, okay, I know diets don't work and I know behaviors are more important, there can still be a lot of support and work that's needed around moving past that, my weight is my worth, right? And so it's a process, and we're not trying to oversimplify it. I think both of us have enough experience to know that it is not ever a straightforward process. And so expect bumps in the road, but anybody who's listening, just know that it's not something that you should be expected to do alone either. You should be able to find healthcare providers who can support you if you're on this journey. So
Yeah.
thank you so, so much, Val. This has been another amazing conversation. Are you ready to answer the question for the third time? What do you think is the missing ingredient in midlife?
The missing ingredient in midlife, I forgot about that question.
I forgot to remind you.
Oh, that's a really good question. I think the missing ingredient might be just this, right? Like what are your values? What are really the priorities? And when you can wrap your head around like, I have these priorities that have shifted and changed, my values have changed, then we don't need to be so attached to the weight-centric narrative. I think one other part to that I feel really passionate about is being authentic. So authenticity, I feel, is something that's a value of mine. And so when I measure my value against, like, yes, this is XYZ bothering me about my body changing or these things, being authentic means when you're doing that, we're helping younger generations too. Like
Yeah.
that person their bodies change, they have wrinkles, and look at them. They're so full of life and, they're vibrant and fun people to be around and engaging and they're smart. Like all of those characteristics are things that we can do, like when we work on body acceptance. So body acceptance, maybe that's my answer. Really, body acceptance in midlife and older probably is the missing ingredient that we need to do a better job on.
I love it. Thank you so much, Val. We'll have all the links to where people can find you in the show notes. But I, as always, appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. It's always the treat.